What's up, everyone? This is Wipeout. Now, GeneralMLD, in your latest video, you said in an analogy that the Nintendo 64 was a more powerful console than the Sony PlayStation, but yet the PlayStation won the console war. Now, I'm going to stop you right there because that happens to be my favorite console war of all time. But I'm going to use that one statement to expose to everyone just how little understanding you have of these consoles' capabilities. And if you can't understand a console war that happened over a decade ago, how could you possibly understand the current console war? Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Do you really believe that the Nintendo 64 was a more powerful console than the Sony PlayStation or the Sega Saturn? Think about that for a second. If it was, would it have been possible to have Metal Gear Solid on the Nintendo 64? Would it have been possible to have Final Fantasy VII on the Nintendo 64? The answer is no. It would have been impossible to have these 32-bit games on Nintendo's 64-bit console. Why? Because the Nintendo 64 was using cartridges which could only hold 64 megabytes of data, and the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation were using CDs that could hold 650 megabytes of data, 10 times the amount. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? If you really want to be thrown for a loop, consider this. Lunar the Silver Star, a Sega CD game, which was 16-bit, essentially a Sega Genesis game, was 500 megabytes. When it came out, it was competing with Super Nintendo RPGs like Final Fantasy III, Secret of Mana, and Chrono Trigger, which were just a few megabytes each. Lunar crushed them technically with high-quality audio, voice acting, sound effects, orchestrated music, animated cutscenes, huge amounts of dialogue, a large game world, and a large variety of enemies. It benefited from the format that the game was on with the increased space, benefited significantly, and offered features that RPGs that it was competing with at the time could not compete with. Now, does it matter that Final Fantasy sold more than Lunar did? No, the sales didn't mean shit. Why? Because the people who bought Lunar back then got to experience something special. They got to experience something unique that the Super Nintendo couldn't do. That's the significance of Blu-ray. Can you imagine? I mean, that 16-bit game couldn't have been on the Nintendo 64. It would have been impossible. Can you imagine how much better the Nintendo 64 would have been if it had a CD-ROM? Can you imagine what Zelda would have been like, or other games, if they had 10 times the space to work with? Do you still think that the Nintendo 64 was a more powerful console than the Sony PlayStation? Sony dominated the 32-bit era with the CD format. They dominated last generation with the DVD format, and they will dominate this generation with the Blu-ray format. When you weebles, you Xbots, and you compare the two systems' capabilities, but you always leave out Blu-ray. You always say, "Oh well, the processor in the PS3 is better, but the GPU in the Xbox is better." So in the end, it evens out. No, it doesn't. The PlayStation 3 is a more powerful system overall. But even if it wasn't, even if these two systems were exactly the same, and the only difference was that one had DVD and one had Blu-ray, the one with Blu-ray would still be far superior. Do you understand now? That is the Sony tradition, giving developers more room and giving them the ability to express themselves in the way that they want to achieve their vision. Giving them the capacity to achieve their vision. They did it 3 times over, and that is the Sony tradition. And I said it before, If you couldn't understand that console generation, what makes you think you can understand this one? That's factual.